what we do. Sin is sometimes just what we experience as separating us from God. So I invite you to imagine that you're a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, and you begin to put the pieces together. You begin to understand the whispers that you've heard, only part of the story, only part of the time. And it all begins to make sense. You know that your family went through a fire when you were just a tiny toddler. You know that your brothers and sisters and your mom and dad lived, and yet the house was decimated. You know you were saved, but as the story unfolds, as the years go by, you start to understand that you had a kindergarten sibling, and that your parents were only two people. And they did their best to get everyone out of the house, except this one sibling was in the bathroom instead of the bedroom. And when that little child opened the door, there was the flashback, and the flames, and the spread of the fire. And you find out when you're 12 or 13 that one of your siblings, that you'll never know until you reach heaven's shore, was lost in that fire. Because your parents had to make choices, because they did their best to get everyone, but because you lived in part, because you were one of the early choices. This other sibling did not. Survivor's guilt, kind of like being in the midst of a war, and a bullet takes the person next to you. And yet you go home to be with your family and your friends, and for the rest of your life try to make sense out of why you survived and the person next to you did not. It's not that much different than waking up one day in America and realizing, wow, I was born into a country where there is shelter and food for the most part for many. It didn't have to be that way. It could have been a birth in Ethiopia 48 years ago. Or as a girl in China 48 years ago. Or in Siberia 5 decades ago when medicine was scarce and the antibiotic that got me through a childhood illness, or you, wasn't available there. Sometimes a person doesn't need to do anything to feel far from God, or to develop at least painful and deep questions about the lives we live, and feel like just being alive and breathing might be part of another's pain and loss. And if you listen closely to the story of the wise ones drawing near to Jesus and giving their gifts last week, you heard in the background of that story, in the midst of the beauty, you heard that one day Jesus found out that there were angels singing and shepherds arriving and wise ones arriving, and a king named Herod who did a terrible thing. And just because Jesus was born and alive and breathing, Herod had thousands upon thousands of little boys under the age of 5 slaughtered to try and get to Jesus. And if you ever wondered why that perfect Jesus we imagined over the years needed to be baptized, I'd suggest that if he was human at all, he had some pretty deep pain and a longing to start fresh, a longing to be set free, as real as any of our longings to start over and fresh and clean and free and unburdened. He too needed that baptismal experience, needed to die to some hurts in his life, needed to feel cleaned and set free, loved and sent to do something good in return for this life that he had been blessed with. And what I've said so far is dark and cold, but that's how it is under the rivers of the water, under the waters of the river Jordan, nose plugged, held under just long enough to be baptized, 1 or 2 minutes, and it would be to die completely. There's something to remembering that our baptismal journeys began as Jesus did, with his dying of sorts and rising with him. And the rising makes no sense without the dying, and the dying begins well before the cross at the baptism. Under those waters, I ask you to hear, to breathe in deep, the words of a man named Carlo Corretto. He had been a geologist, then he became a spiritual leader of sorts, after he had his body shattered and limped away, limped to a new life in Christ. He writes these words: "Do you believe that everything is a part of a plan, a design, an intervention of God in our affairs?" He writes, "I do, and I am convinced that God's love can transform the darkness of disaster or the irrationality of an earthquake into an event that can influence or completely change our lives." Says Carlo, "I came upon this passage in St. Augustine's work. God can permit evil only insofar as God is capable of transforming it into good." And whoosh, Jesus is lifted out of the chilly waters of the Jordan. God could permit Herod's evil only insofar as God is going to be able to transform it into something good and whole and life-giving and world-changing, to set the world free from those horrors. Or in God's words to Jesus, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." Jesus needed to hear those words as much as any of us. And we need to hear those words as much as Jesus needed to hear them. I don't know what hurts you're carrying today. I don't know what pain lingers from years gone by, or what challenges will come up in your future, or my future, for that matter. What I do know is God isn't looking to kill you and leave it at that. Life will take care of the killing. God is looking to raise you. What I do know is Jesus didn't die so we could be dead and buried, but so we could be alive and free. What I do know is God can work and does work through anything and everything to bring us new life if we will reach for it. What I do know is love heals everything where nothing else can heal. Priest and author James Kavanaugh writes these words: "Love alone heals. The torn ligaments of a lifetime, the limping, wounded, shredded legs that in vain tried to climb a mountain finally too tall. Love alone heals the broken bones and battered limbs of living, the weary, bleeding, aching arms that cling in vain to trees in hurricanes. Love alone heals the congealed sadness and hidden fears, the buried madness and unshed tears that hoped in vain to still the roar of endless oceans. Love alone heals the hearts that knock at empty doors and crawl across the splintered floors to search for soothing breezes in a fragrant valley. Love alone heals and waits in silence for storms to cease, offering laughter and unshaken peace for those who tried to find their tearful way alone and finally found it in God's embrace, waiting for them to come home." I invite us to remember that we are loved just as we are. We are baptized and cleansed, rinsed, set free, called to share a message of kindness. Will you accept